Story 1. There's something about the river at dawn that makes you feel completely alone with the world. The mist rolls across the surface like a thick blanket, and the only sounds are the gentle lapping of water against the boat and the distant calls of birds waking up. It's peaceful, almost too peaceful. I've been fishing on that river for years. I know its currents, its bends, and the best spots to catch something decent. But what happened that morning changed everything. I still don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there. And the worst part, I don't think it was ever really gone. I woke up before the sun, just like I always did. Fishing at dawn had become my routine, something to ground me in the stillness of the morning before the world got too loud. I grabbed my gear, loaded up my small boat, and paddled out into the river, heading toward my usual spot where I'd placed my hooks the day before. It was calm, nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw it. There was an empty boat drifting a little ways off. Now, seeing an abandoned boat on the river wasn't unusual. Sometimes people didn't tie them up properly, and the current would carry them downstream. But this one felt different. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured someone had left it there by accident. But when I got closer, I noticed something strange. There were 3 fish lying inside. Not old half-rotten fish, but fresh ones. Their scales still shimmered, wet and glistening in the soft morning light, like they had just been caught. And then I saw the paddle. It was resting inside the boat, but there were droplets of water on it, as if someone had been using it not long before I got there. That's what got me. It wasn't just some abandoned boat. Someone had been in it, recently. I sat there in my own boat for a while, just staring at it, waiting to see if someone would come back for it. Nothing happened. The river stretched out before me, empty and silent. I should have left it alone. I should have ignored it and gone about my morning. But curiosity, it's a funny thing. Eventually, I shrugged it off. Maybe someone caught the fish and left to get something. Or maybe they'd come back for it later. I hung my hooks, set my lines, and paddled back home, shaking off the weird feeling in my gut. That evening, just before sunset, I headed back to check my hooks. The air had a strange weight to it, thicker, heavier. The river that once felt like home now felt different. I paddled toward my usual spot, and that's when I saw it again. The boat, it was still there, in almost the exact same spot. But something was different this time. I could feel it before I even got close. There were more fish inside, 7 this time, laid out neatly, like someone had carefully placed them there. And the paddle, it wasn't where it had been that morning. It was resting at a new angle, and fresh droplets of water lined the edges of the boat again. I stopped paddling, my breath catching in my throat. The river was quiet, too quiet. I looked around, half expecting to see someone hiding in the trees along the shore, watching me. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the water, and that boat, waiting. A cold chill ran through me. Something wasn't right. My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone, to turn back. But against my better judgment, I decided to take a closer look. I paddled toward it slowly, every muscle in my body tense. As I got closer, I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice felt small against the vastness of the river. Nothing, just the soft ripple of water as my boat drifted closer. I reached out to grab the side of the empty boat when I heard it, a soft splash just beneath the surface. My heart slammed against my chest as I looked down. The water was murky, dark, but something moved down there. It wasn't a fish, it wasn't debris, it was something else. My grip on the paddle tightened, and for a moment I sat there frozen, staring at the water. I could feel something watching me, waiting. My skin prickled, and the air around me felt heavier. Then, the boat rocked, not from the wind, not from my touch, but from something underneath it. I yanked my hand back, my breath coming in short gasps. My body screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. My eyes locked onto the boat, and I swear I saw the water ripple again, like something was trying to climb in. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my boat around and paddled as fast as I could, my hands shaking with every stroke. I didn't stop until I was back on shore, my feet hitting the ground with an urgency I couldn't explain. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside my window made me jump. I kept hearing the sound of water lapping against the sides of a boat in my head. And the worst part, I swore I could still feel something watching me. I didn't go back to that part of the river again. I avoided it like the plague. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up to the sound of water dripping outside my window. Soft, steady, like something or someone had followed me home. To this day, I wonder what was in that boat, who or what was placing those fish inside. If I had stayed a little longer, if I had leaned just a little closer, would I have seen something I wasn't supposed to? And if I did, would I have ever made it back to shore? Story 2. My name is Olivia, and I thought my trip to South America would be an adventure of a lifetime. I had saved up for this, planned every detail, and made sure I booked my stay through a reputable tourism company. But looking back now, I realized that no amount of planning could have prepared me for what I encountered. When I arrived at the accommodation provided for me, disappointment washed over me instantly. The place was far from the luxurious retreat I had envisioned. The walls had cracks running through them. The furniture looked as though it had seen better decades, and the air smelled musty, like it had been shut away from the world for too long. Considering how much I had paid, I was already drafting a scathing review in my head, but that would be the least of my worries. It was the peak of summer, and the heat was relentless. I spent my days at the beach, cooling off in the waves, chatting with the locals, indulging in delicious food, and taking countless pictures. There were kind people who welcomed me with warm smiles, but there were also the ones who gave off an eerie vibe, the kind you couldn't quite put your finger on, but knew to avoid. That evening, exhausted from my excursions, I returned to my accommodation, eager to relax. Dinner was served, and I had to admit it was delicious. As I finished my meal, a woman from the hospitality staff came to clear the table. She had a kind face, but there was something about the way she lingered that made me uneasy. As she turned to leave, she hesitated before speaking in a low, serious tone. "Our company won't be sending anyone else to your room tonight, unless you personally call for assistance," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "If anyone comes, anyone at all, they are not from us." A nervous laugh escaped me. "That's a strange thing to say." She didn't smile. "I mean it. Lock your door. Do not open it, no matter what you hear." Then she left, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I tried to shake off her words. Maybe it was just some local superstition, or a way to make tourists feel on edge for the thrill of it. Either way, I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin my trip. Hours later, as I scrolled through my phone in bed, my eyelids grew heavy. I was moments away from sleep when something caught my attention. The door to my room had a small hole where the knob was broken, a detail I had noticed but thought nothing of before. But now, something was moving. A long, yellowed fingernail, jagged and filthy, slowly inched through the hole, scratching against the wood. My breath caught in my throat. That was not a human fingernail. It was too long, too curved, too unnatural. I was frozen in place, every part of me screaming to move, to hide, well, to do something, but I was paralyzed. The fingernail twitched, then retreated, only to be replaced by another, then another. There were more of them. Something was behind that door. Something was trying to get in. A wave of cold dread crashed over me. I didn't want to see what it was. I couldn't. If I made a sound, would it know I was awake? Would that make it more aggressive? Then, as if sensing my fear, the scratching stopped. The room was so silent, I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. And then, a soft, guttural whisper. "Olivia." My name. It knew my name. My blood turned to ice. I didn't care if I looked like a lunatic. I screamed at the top of my lungs. The sound shattered the stillness, and within minutes, the management burst into my room. I pointed at the door, my words coming out in frantic gasps. There was someone trying to get in. They checked the hallway. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No marks on the door. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. I was hysterical, but what could I say? That a clawed hand had tried to pry my door open, that something had whispered my name in the dark. They wouldn't believe me. Hell, I wouldn't have believed me, so I swallowed the truth and lied. It was just a nightmare. The staff exchanged glances but didn't press me further. I demanded a new room, and they obliged, though I could tell they were skeptical. I didn't sleep that night, and in 48 hours, I was on the first flight out of that country. I never left a review. I never spoke of it again. But to this day, I still wonder, how did it know my name? Story 3. It all started with a coin flip. We were 4 friends, Jack, George, Noah, and me, Ivy. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, but when it came to choosing the location, we couldn't agree. Jack and I had our hearts set on this secluded forest in Wales. It was quiet, surrounded by tall, ancient trees and far away from the noise of the city. But George and Noah weren't convinced. They thought it was too isolated, too eerie. "Come on, guys," Jack had said, flipping the coin in his hand. "Heads, we go to the forest. Tails, we pick somewhere else." George and Noah exchanged uneasy glances. "Fine," George said, "but let's make it best of 3. One flip isn't enough." Jack agreed, and the coin was flipped. Heads again, heads, and one more time. Heads 3 times in a row. It felt like the universe was pushing us toward the forest. Even George and Noah couldn't argue with that. So we packed up the car and drove to the edge of the woods, where the trees loomed tall and the air was thick with the scent of pine. The first night was perfect. We unpacked, set up our tents, and cleared a small area for a campfire. Jack brought out his guitar and we spent the evening singing and laughing under the stars. Even George and Noah seemed to relax, their earlier reservations fading as the wine flowed and the fire crackled. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The forest was so quiet, so still, it felt like we were the only people for miles. When we finally went to bed, I slept like a rock. No nightmares, no strange sounds, just the deep, dreamless sleep of someone completely at ease. The second day started just as pleasantly as the first. We spent the morning exploring the area around our campsite, collecting firewood, and taking pictures of the scenery. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and birds chirping in the distance. But then, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep orange, we heard it, a scream. It was sharp and piercing, like the sound of someone in pain. It echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. We all froze, our laughter dying in our throats. "What was that?" George asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just an animal," Jack said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Animals don't scream like that," Noah muttered, his eyes scanning the trees. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but the sound had been too human, too desperate. Still, we tried to brush it off. We played games, drank more wine, and eventually went to bed, though I could tell none of us slept as soundly as we had the night before. The next morning, we decided to explore the forest further. The scream was still fresh in our minds, but we convinced ourselves it was just our imaginations running wild. We packed some snacks and water, grabbed our flashlights just in case, and set off into the woods. The trees were taller and denser. The further we went, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of birds and insects faded, leaving only the crunch of leaves under our feet. "This place is creepy," George said, his voice echoing in the silence. "It's just a forest," Jack replied, though even he seemed uneasy. We walked for what felt like hours, the path growing narrower and more overgrown. Eventually we came across a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone structure. A well. "What's a well doing out here?" Noah asked, stepping closer to inspect it. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I approached the well. The stones were moss-covered and cracked, and the wooden bucket that once hung above it was now just a pile of rotted wood. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But before we could turn back, we heard it again. The scream. This time, it was closer, louder. And it wasn't just one scream. It was multiple overlapping voices, all crying out in pain and fear. We froze, our eyes wide with terror. "We need to go now," George said, his voice shaking. We turned and ran, the screams following us as we stumbled through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around us, the branches clawing at our clothes and skin. We finally made it back to the campsite, breathless and trembling. The screams had stopped, but the memory of them lingered, haunting us. That night, as we sat around the fire, we tried to make sense of what had happened. "There has to be a logical explanation," Jack said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Logical?" We heard people screaming in the middle of the forest, George snapped. Maybe it was the wind, Noah suggested, though even he didn't believe it. I stayed quiet, my mind racing. There was something about that, well, something wrong. The next morning, we decided to leave. We packed up our things as quickly as we could, the forest now feeling more like a prison than a paradise. But as we drove away, I glanced out the window and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing among the trees, its hollow eyes fixed on us. Story 4. I worked the night shift at a small, quiet gas station just off the highway. It's not the kind of job that most people dream of, but it's steady, and I don't mind the quiet. Most nights, it's just me, the hum of the overhead lights, and the occasional trucker stopping by for gas or coffee. There's something peaceful about it, or at least there used to be. Lately, though, I've noticed something strange. Every night, around the same time, somewhere between midnight and 1, this car pulls up across the street. It doesn't park at the station, doesn't pull into a spot, just stops in the darkness on the opposite side of the road and sits there. The headlights are always off. No movement, no sign of why they're there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone waiting for a ride, or some driver needing a break. But they never come in, they never roll down their window or make a call. They just sit there, watching. I remember telling myself it was nothing, just some guy killing time. But night after night, the same car, the same spot, and the same eerie stillness. It didn't take long before it started to get under my skin. I'd glance out through the large front windows of the station, and there it would be, just barely visible in the glow of the streetlights. One night, curiosity got the best of me. I stepped outside, pretending to take out the trash. The air was cool, and the highway behind me was quiet, just the occasional distant roar of a passing semi. I tried to act casual, walking toward the dumpster, but my eyes were locked on that car. The driver was there. I could see the faint outline of their figure behind the wheel, but they didn't move. They didn't even look at me, or at least it seemed that way. I couldn't see their face. The darkness inside the car was too thick, and something about it made my stomach knot. I lingered for a moment, waiting to see if they'd react to me being out there. But nothing, just silence. I told myself to forget about it, to mind my own business. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few nights, I started watching more closely. It became part of my routine, stocking shelves, cleaning the coffee pots, and then without fail, glancing outside to see if they were back. And they always were. One night, I decided to test them. I turned off the station lights early and crouched down behind the counter, watching through a crack in the blinds. The car stayed, no headlights flashing, no signs of impatience, just sitting. I waited for over an hour, frozen behind the counter, but they never left. I mentioned it to my coworker the next day during the shift change. He laughed it off, said, "People are weird at night," and shrugged it away. But I could tell he didn't really believe me. Things got worse after that. It started small, the feeling of being watched, not just from the car, but from around the station itself. Late at night, when the station was quiet, I started hearing things, faint shuffling noises near the dumpsters, the rustling of bushes that shouldn't have been moving. One night, while restocking the fridge in the back, I heard it, a faint tapping on the front glass. I froze, listening. The tapping came again, steady and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest, and I slowly crept toward the front of the store. The lot outside was empty. No customers, no one at the pump. But across the street, the car was there. And even though I couldn't see the driver's face, I knew they were staring right at me. I locked the doors after that, something I'd never bothered to do before. We were a 24-hour station, and the doors were supposed to stay open, but I couldn't risk it. Not anymore. And then, the car door opened. I watched as a figure stepped out. They stood there for a moment, their silhouette barely illuminated by the flickering streetlight above them. I could make out the shape of their head turning, their gaze locked onto the gas station. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. I didn't know if I should call the cops or just hide. Before I could decide, they turned around and got back into the car, slowly closing the door. I stood there for what felt like forever, watching, waiting, but they didn't move. The next night, I came prepared. I brought a baseball bat from home and kept it behind the counter. I felt ridiculous, but at least it gave me some sense of security. Around midnight, the car showed up again. I locked the doors early and kept my eyes on it, waiting for anything to happen. And then, the power flickered. Just for a second, the lights dimmed, and the store went eerily quiet. I stood frozen, listening. That's when I saw it, movement at the edge of the window. A shadow, quick and deliberate, moving just outside my line of sight. I grabbed the bat, my hands slick with sweat, and backed into the storage room. I stood there, breathing heavily, waiting to hear something, anything. After a few minutes of silence, I peeked out. The car was gone. That was the night I finally called the police. When they arrived, I explained everything. The car, the figure, the noises. They searched the lot, checked the security footage, but nothing useful came up. The cameras had glitched right around the time the lights flickered. They asked if I had seen a license plate, but it was always too dark to tell. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but I knew it wouldn't help. 2 nights later, the car was back. I made up my mind then and there. I had to quit. Whatever this was, it wasn't worth my safety. I put in my notice and left that job a week later. But the worst part, I never got any answers. I still wonder who that person was. What did they want? Were they just watching me? Or were they planning something worse? And the scariest question of all, what if one night, they had actually come inside? I don't work the night shift anymore, but I'll tell you this. Every time I pass by a gas station late at night, I catch myself looking across the street, half expecting to see that same dark car. And sometimes, I think I do. Have you ever had the feeling that someone's watching you, even when no one's supposed to be there? Story 5. I was only a student, focused on passing the final stretch of medical school with my friends Lisa, Mark, Emily, and Josh. But none of us could have predicted what would happen when we started working on John Doe 432. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural, but as we spent more time in that lab, I began to doubt my own mind. I began to wonder if we had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed. My name is Ryan, and during my final year in medical school, we were tasked with a special project, something that was supposed to be routine for any student about to graduate. We were given a cadaver for dissection, a chance to perform advanced procedures, and to make our final preparations for the profession we'd spent years training for. It should have been just another step in the process, another way to learn before we moved on to the real world of practicing medicine. But what should have been a simple task became something much worse. We received a body from the morgue, a middle-aged man with no name, no history. Just a simple toe tag that read John Doe 432. The body was unclaimed, as if he had been forgotten in life and left to be used for our project after his death. We didn't know it then, but the moment we started to work on him, we'd set something in motion, something we would never be able to stop. At first, it seemed like any other dissection. We carefully examined the body, marking the areas we needed to cut into for our procedures, but something wasn't right. The room itself felt colder, no matter how high we turned up the heat. It wasn't just the usual chill of the morgue, it was something else. Every time we moved closer to the body, the temperature dropped a little more, like the very air was pulling away from us. Emily, always the more observant one, was the first to notice something odd. She swore that just for a moment she saw his fingers twitch. Of course, we all laughed it off, chalking it up to post-mortem muscle contractions. It wasn't unheard of, but the more we worked on him, the more strange things began to happen. Lisa, who had been working closest to the body, was the next to notice something unsettling. She insisted that his lips moved, just the slightest shift, as though he were trying to speak. We all ignored her, saying it was just our minds playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then there were his eyes. His glassy, lifeless eyes, which should have been empty, seemed to follow us. Every time I looked up, I felt his gaze on me. I couldn't bring myself to meet his stare for too long, and the others started avoiding his eyes too. It was subtle, but it was there, watching us. It wasn't just the body that started to get under our skin. The lab itself began to feel wrong. There were strange occurrences that couldn't be explained away. Late one evening, Mark and I stayed behind to finish some work. We'd been alone for hours, and the place was eerily silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the hum of fluorescent lights above. Then we heard it, a soft tapping. At first we thought it was just something in the building settling, but the sound grew louder or distinct, like something was tapping against metal, softly but persistently. I looked over at Mark, and he looked at me, his expression uneasy. "It's coming from the storage locker," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We both stood up and walked toward the locker where the cadaver had been placed. The sheet covering him had been moved, just slightly, as if someone had shifted it, but we hadn't touched it. The air around us felt thick, heavier than it should have been. My heart started racing, and I felt the coldness of the room seeping deeper into my bones. We opened the locker, and the body was still there. Nothing had changed, but something was different. We closed it again quickly, and neither of us said a word as we left the room. That wasn't the only thing. Josh, who had been in the dorms for the night, received a call from an unknown number the next evening. It was just a few minutes after we had finished our final procedure on the cadaver. When Josh answered the phone, there was nothing but heavy breathing on the other end. And then, in a voice that was barely audible, a whisper came through the line, "You shouldn't have touched me." Josh's face went pale, and he immediately hung up, but we all knew something was happening. None of us could explain it, but we were all beginning to feel that something had crossed over from the other side of the morgue table. Things started to get worse after that. One evening, as we were reviewing our project reports, we found something we couldn't explain. Our neatly typed notes were now covered in words, written in red ink. "I am still here." None of us admitted to writing it. We hadn't. But there it was, in thick, scrawled letters, as if the body itself had come back to life, its last will to be remembered scrawled across our work. We couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, and none of us wanted to be the one to confront it. The breaking point came during our final examination of the body. Mark, who had been working closest to the cadaver, suddenly collapsed. He gasped for air, clutching his throat as though something were choking him, but there was no one around. None of us had touched him. He swore he felt hands cold like death itself gripping him and cutting off his air. We called for help, and Mark was taken to the hospital. But after that, we couldn't go on. We knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a simple cadaver anymore. It was something else. We requested a different body, one that hadn't been disturbed. But when the staff checked the storage locker, John Doe 432 was gone. The toe tag was still there, but the body was gone. After that, we all graduated and moved on with our lives. But none of us ever spoke about John Doe 432 again. None of us wanted to. Lisa left medicine completely. Mark moved across the country without telling anyone why. Emily, who had been the most reluctant to talk about the body, refused to even acknowledge it. As for me, I've spent every day since wondering if we disturbed something that should have been left alone. I still feel that presence sometimes, that sensation that I'm being watched. It's most intense when I'm alone in the hospital late at night, but it lingers even when I'm at home. And the scariest part, I still get calls from an unknown number. When I answer, all I hear is a whisper. What did we do to that body? What did we wake up? I still don't have the answers. Story 6, hospitals at night are different. The bright, sterile lights hum overhead, but the halls feel empty. Time moves slower, and every little sound beeping monitors. The shuffle of footsteps feels louder, more significant. I've worked the night shift long enough to know what's normal and what's not. But that night was different. I was making my usual rounds, the same routine I'd done hundreds of times before. Checking vitals, adjusting IV drips, responding to the occasional call light. Most of the patients were asleep. The hallways were quiet, and everything seemed normal. Until I saw him. At the far end of the hallway, near the restricted wing, stood a man. He was wearing a standard hospital gown, barefoot, just standing there. At first I thought he was one of our patients, maybe someone confused, disoriented, wandering from his room. It happens more often than you'd think. Post-surgery patients, those with dementia, they end up where they're not supposed to be all the time. But something about him felt off. I called out, "Sir, you shouldn't be here." My voice echoed down the empty hall, but he didn't respond. He didn't move. He just kept staring at the double doors marked authorized personnel only. I picked up my pace, trying to reach him before he could go inside, but the moment I got close enough, he turned. and walked right through those doors. Just like that, I hesitated. That part of the hospital was under renovation. No patients were supposed to be in there, only maintenance staff and storage. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed doors, trying to make sense of it. Then I hurried back to the nurse's station and pulled up the patient logs. I checked and rechecked, scrolling through name after name, but there was nothing. No record of him. Not from today, not from the past week. Feeling a knot tightening in my stomach, I called security. They swept through the restricted area and found nothing, not a single sign of him. The weirdest part, the security cameras covering that hallway had mysteriously malfunctioned. They showed static from the exact moment he appeared to when security arrived. My coworkers told me I was tired, overworked, probably imagining things, but I know what I saw. I know he was real. Over the next few nights, I started noticing things, little things at first. A hospital gown, crumpled in the corner of an empty patient room. The soft shuffle of footsteps in a hallway I knew was empty. Call lights flickering on and off in vacant rooms. Once while I was preparing medications in the break room, I caught something in the reflection of the glass window. Him, standing just outside, staring at me. I whipped around so fast, I nearly knocked over the medication cart, but when I stepped into the hall, he was gone. It was getting harder to pretend everything was normal. I started dreading my rounds, especially near that restricted wing. But the worst part, the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, I felt it. Every time I turned my back, I could sense him, lingering in the corners of my vision, just far enough away that I could never catch him in time. Then came the night that changed everything. I was finishing up the last of my rounds when I realized I was running low on supplies. The storage room was down the hall near the restricted wing. I tried to ignore the unease curling in my chest as I walked down the corridor, reminding myself that I was being ridiculous. But the moment I stepped inside the supply closet, I heard it breathing, slow, shallow, right behind me. I spun around, and there he was, blocking the doorway. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, eyes locked onto mine, his face completely devoid of emotion. My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, to run, and do many things at that time. My heart hammered so loud I was sure he could hear it. Then, the lights flickered, just for a second, and when they came back on, he was gone. I didn't waste a second. I bolted from that room, practically tripping over my own feet as I rushed back to the nurse's station. I told my supervisor everything, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They checked the logs again. No patients were unaccounted for. That's when I knew whatever was going on, I was on my own. I couldn't let it go. The next day, I started digging through old hospital records, going back years. What I found made my skin crawl. There had been a patient years ago, admitted for a psychiatric evaluation. He was known for wandering the halls at night, mumbling to himself, trying to get into places he wasn't supposed to. One night, he vanished, just disappeared from his room, never to be seen again. They searched everywhere, the hospital, the surrounding neighborhoods, even the underground maintenance tunnels, but nothing. He was never found, presumed to have wandered outside and died. But the description of him, the way he looked, the gown, the vacant expression, it was an exact match to the man I'd been seeing. I felt sick. I wasn't imagining him. He was real, or at least he had been. I transferred to a different department shortly after that. I couldn't handle those night shifts anymore. Every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corner of my eye, it was too much. I needed to get out, but even now I still think about him. I wonder what he wanted, why he kept showing up. Was he trying to find his way out? Was he trying to warn me about something? Or was it something else entirely? And the scariest thought, the one that keeps me up at night, what if he's not the only one still wandering these halls? Story 7. Have you ever had that feeling that someone's watching you, even when you're completely alone? I used to think it was just my imagination. Just the way your mind plays with you when you work in a place like this. But now I'm not so sure. I worked the night shift at a warehouse just off the highway. It wasn't a bad job. In fact, I kind of liked it. Stocking shelves, sorting inventory, scanning items in and out. It gave me time to think and some time to plan things outside my work life. The place was massive, rows and rows of shelves stacked high with boxes stretching out into the darkness. There were a few guys on the shift, but for the most part, I was alone in my section. Nights were quiet. The hum of conveyor belts, the occasional crack of the building settling, and the distant chatter from the security radio up front. That was all normal, but then things started happening. Little things, things that didn't sit right. At first it was nothing obvious. Boxes were in the wrong place. Pallets shifted slightly, just enough to make me wonder if I was remembering things wrong. I'd find tools left out that I swore I had put away. I told myself it was exhaustion, or maybe I was just losing focus, but it wasn't. Then I started hearing it. Footsteps, not the kind that echo from across the building. No, these were close. Just around the corner, moving through the aisles when I knew I was alone. I remember one night, I was stacking boxes in one of the back aisles. It was quiet, like always, when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, just beyond the shelves. I called out thinking it was one of the other workers. Hey, someone there. Nothing. I stepped out, peered around the corner, and there was no one. Just rows of shelves stretching into the dimly lit expanse of the warehouse. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was the building settling, or maybe my own footsteps echoing weirdly. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I mentioned it to the security guard up front, but he just shrugged and said, "Night shifts mess with your head, man. It's probably nothing," but I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't as sure as he sounded. Then things got stranger. One night, while doing my usual walkthrough, I found something that didn't belong. In the back corner of the warehouse, on top of a crate, there was a half-eaten sandwich. Now, I know what you're thinking. Big deal, right? Someone probably left it there. But here's the thing, it wasn't from our shift. No one eats back there. And it wasn't stale, it was fresh. Someone had been there. Recently, I stared at it for a long time, trying to lie to myself it was left by the day shift. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't say anything to anyone. What was I going to say? That a sandwich freaked me out? That doesn't make much sense. But after that, I started noticing more. Small things. A roll of tape missing from my workstation, only to show up across the warehouse the next day. A clipboard I always left in one spot, suddenly appearing somewhere else. It felt like someone was moving through the place when I wasn't looking. And then came the night that changed everything. I was loading a shipment onto a pallet, deep in the back aisles when I felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The kind you get when someone's watching you. I turned around slowly, and for a split second, I saw it. A shadow, moving between the shelves, fast, deliberate. Not the usual shifting of light from passing cars outside. No, this was different. I dropped what I was holding, and bolted straight to the security office. I needed proof. I had to know I wasn't losing my mind. The guard and I checked the security footage together. At first it showed nothing. Just me, moving around, doing my job. But then at exactly 2:37 a.m., something appeared at the edge of the frame. A figure, not a shadow, not a blur, a man, standing there, watching. And then, he moved. He didn't rush, he didn't panic. He just slipped deeper into the warehouse, disappearing between the aisles. My heart sank. This wasn't just some weird coincidence. Someone was in here, watching me. The guards did a full sweep of the building, but they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, just empty aisles. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably a homeless guy sneaking in for shelter. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. That same night, when I went to grab my things from the locker room, I noticed something chilling. My locker was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. And inside, my work ID was missing. Someone had been in there, going through my stuff. That was the moment I realized, whoever this was, they weren't just watching, they were targeting me. I quit the job a week later. I didn't even wait for my paycheck. Management tried to downplay everything, sticking to their homeless guy theory. They said they'd beef up security, but I didn't care. I was done. Story 8, you can never really know who you're letting into your car. You might think you do. You check the name, the pickup location, maybe glance at a profile picture. But in reality, you're trusting a complete stranger with your safety. I've been driving for a rideshare service for a couple of years now, mostly nights. People coming home from bars, airports, late-night shifts, you get all kinds. The talkative drunks, the awkward first dates, the tired workers who just want to sit in silence. But there was one night, one ride, that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Started like any other shift, I was parked outside a 24-hour dinner, sipping my coffee, watching the occasional car pass by. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Nights like these are usually the easiest, just a couple of trips, and I'd call it early. Then my phone buzzed, a new ride request popped up. No profile picture, just a name, Sam. Normally, I'd think nothing of it. Some people prefer not to upload a picture, and that's fine. But the pickup location caught my attention. It was an old gas station, one of those places that's been out of business for years, the kind you only see when you're driving out of town and need to pull over for directions. It sat right on the edge of the city, where the streetlights are few and far between. Something about it didn't sit right with me, but work is work, and I accepted the ride. When I pulled up, the place was dead silent. No cars, no people. Just a single flickering streetlight, barely illuminating the cracked pavement. I scanned the area, expecting to see someone coming from behind the station, but instead, a figure stepped out from the shadows near the old air pump. Tall, wearing a hooded jacket, hands buried deep in their pockets. They didn't wave, didn't say anything, just opened the back door and got in, closing it softly behind them. I glanced in the rearview mirror, forcing a smile. "Hey there, you're Sam." No answer, just the slow, steady sound of their breathing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I kept it together. Maybe they were just shy. Some people don't like small talk, and I could respect that. I checked the app for the destination, a street I didn't recognize. I tapped on the map, trying to get a sense of where we were headed. It didn't lead anywhere familiar, just a dead-end road near an abandoned industrial park. A weird place to be going this late at night, but I didn't ask questions. I started driving. The road stretched out ahead, long and empty. The hum of the tires and the occasional streetlight slipping past were the only sounds. I kept stealing glances at the mirror. The passenger just sat there, staring straight ahead, their hood pulled down low over their face. After a few minutes I tried again. So, long night, nothing. That's when I noticed it. The smell, faint but distinct, something metallic, hanging in the air. It reminded me of rust or blood. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was something in the car. I hadn't cleaned it in a while. I rolled down the window a little, hoping to clear it out, but the smell lingered. I stole another glance at the passenger in the mirror. They hadn't moved an inch, just sitting there, hands resting on their lap. And that's when I saw it, a glimpse of something metallic, tucked inside their jacket, small, but I knew enough to recognize the shape of a weapon when I saw one. A knife, a gun. My chest tightened. I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was. I reached slowly for the center console, feeling for the pocket knife I kept stashed there, just in case. My fingers found it, and I held it tight, my knuckles going white. The further we drove, the darker it got. Streetlights were farther apart, and soon we were in an area I'd never seen before. The cracked pavement, the abandoned warehouses looming in the distance. The GPS said we were close, but I couldn't see anything, just emptiness. Finally, the robotic voice chimed, "You have arrived." I looked around. There was nothing here, just an empty lot surrounded by chain-link fences. No houses, no businesses, no signs of life. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. This is it?" No answer. The passenger just sat there. My fingers tightened around my knife. I was ready to bolt, but I needed a way out. I forced a laugh. "Looks like a wrong address, huh? Maybe I should take you back." That's when they moved. Slowly their hand reached for the door handle, and stopped. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Then a low voice, calm and quiet, spoke for the first time. "Drive." I didn't argue. I pulled out of there fast, back toward the city, not caring if I was speeding. I kept checking the mirror, but they just sat there, their heads slightly turned now, watching me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get back to where there were people, streetlights, cameras, anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they spoke again. Here. I slammed the brakes at a quiet intersection. Without a word, they opened the door, stepped out, and disappeared into the darkness. No thank you, no goodbye. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, trying to catch my breath. Then I locked the doors and sped off, shaking all over. When I got home, I checked the app. No record of the trip. No sign that Sam had ever requested a ride. It was like it never happened. I contacted the rideshare company, but they found nothing. No requests from that location. No records of a passenger matching that name. They told me it was probably just a system glitch, but I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I felt. After that night, I started keeping pepper spray within reach. I don't drive out to those isolated areas anymore. Have you ever had an encounter with someone who just didn't feel right? What would you have done in my shoes? Story 9. My name is Daniel, and for the last few years before I retired, I worked maintenance at a remote highway rest stop in Wyoming. It wasn't a bad job, quiet for the most part. My days were spent cleaning up, restocking supplies, and occasionally helping out stranded travelers. But I always felt there was something strange about those empty roads, something unsettling about the silence that stretched across the land like a living thing. You hear things out there, things that don't belong, and sometimes, if you aren't careful, something hears you back. One evening, just before the sun dipped behind the hills, the woman from the information desk hurried over to me. Her face looked uneasy. Dan, can you check on that guy hanging around the dumpsters? He's creeping people out. I frowned. I hadn't noticed anyone earlier, but as I made my way over, I saw him. A figure draped in a long, tattered robe, hunched over the trash, moving in slow, deliberate motions, like he was searching for something important. The robe was filthy, dirt-stained, frayed at the edges, and hanging loosely around a frame that looked both frail and impossibly strong at the same time. Sir, I called out. The figure froze, slowly, almost painfully. The man turned toward me. His hood was low, concealing most of his face, but then he lifted his head just enough. Beneath the shadow of the hood, I saw one eye, just one, pure black. Not like a normal eye, not even like a pupil blown wide from the dark. It was void, like staring into a bottomless pit, an abyss that looked back at you. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. The man didn't speak, didn't move, just watched, and I felt something primal claw up my spine. An instinct buried deep in my bones told me not to get closer. I backed away, left him alone. When I clocked out that evening, the robed man was still sitting there, unmoving, watching. By the time I drove away, the sky had turned dark, and something about that empty highway behind me never felt right again. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Not physically, nothing as obvious as that, but something had attached itself to me. I started waking up at odd hours, feeling watched. My dog, usually calm, began barking at nothing, growling at corners of the room. Then, a week later, I saw him again. Not at work, not at the rest stop, but outside my house. I had just finished washing up for the night when I happened to glance out the kitchen window, and there, standing just beyond the glow of the porch light, was the robed figure, still, silent, watching. My breath hitched. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Over the next few nights, I began losing time. I'd wake up standing in the backyard, unable to remember how I got there. My dreams were worse. My dreams were worse. I started seeing things in my sleep. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding like a war drum, but the moment I opened my eyes, I'd forget what I had dreamed about. Just a lingering sense of dread remained, thick and suffocating. Every morning, I'd wake up exhausted, feeling like I hadn't rested at all. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I kept seeing him. The robed figure never approached, never spoke. He was just there, sometimes at the edge of the woods behind my house, sometimes standing beneath the streetlight across the road, always at a distance, but always close enough that I could feel his presence like an infection seeping into my bones. I started changing my routines. I'd leave work earlier or later than usual, hoping to throw off whatever twisted game he was playing. I avoided looking out the windows at night, drawing the curtains shut tight. I even started sleeping with the lights on, though it didn't make much difference. The feeling of being watched never left. The worst part was that no one else ever saw him. My neighbor, an older man named Frank, would joke about me seeing ghosts whenever I mentioned something odd around my property. My dog, Toby, was the only one who seemed to sense it too. Every night, he would growl low and deep, his fur standing on end, staring at the same spots where I had seen the rogue man standing before. Then, things escalated. One night, I woke up gasping for air, my chest tight as if someone had been pressing down on it. The room was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw a shadow, tall, draped in ragged cloth, standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. The figure loomed closer, silent as the grave, and just as its hood tilted forward, I blacked out. When I came to, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. My sheets were damp with sweat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the bedside table as I tried to stand. I had never experienced sleep paralysis before, but that wasn't sleep paralysis. That was real. I stopped sleeping properly after that. I dozed off in small bursts, never long enough to dream, but long enough to get by. I left every light in the house on, even when I wasn't home. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I ignored him long enough, he'd go away. Then exactly 1 month after I first saw him, he vanished. Just like that. I didn't see him at work. I didn't see him outside my house. I didn't wake up to find him looming over me in the dead of night. The heavy dread that had weighed on my chest for weeks slowly started to lift, like a fever breaking after a long illness. I should have felt relief, but I didn't, because I knew deep down I hadn't gotten rid of him. He had just chosen to leave, and that terrified me more than anything. Story 10. I don't know why, but that night something felt wrong. Maybe it was the air, thick and unnaturally still, suffocating the usual night sounds. Or maybe it was the way the trees outside stood motionless, like they were holding their breath. But the moment I stepped out of my car, an icy sensation crawled up my spine, and I knew something wasn't right. I was back at my parents' house for the night, staying there while my father recovered from his recent health issues. I had done this countless times before, but tonight the air carried an uneasy weight, pressing against my skin like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. The house was dark and quiet when I unlocked the front door. My mom and dad were still at the hospital, and as far as I knew, no one else had been in the house that day. Normally, I would walk straight to my old bedroom or settle in the living room, but instead I hesitated. A nagging sensation told me not to go any further inside. I stepped into the small room by the entrance, the one with the computer, and let the glow of the monitor push back the suffocating darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just needed to distract myself, so I sat down and started scrolling through the internet, anything to shake off the gnawing feeling creeping under my skin. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. I turned, heart stuttering in my chest, and saw my cat standing in the doorway. It was my sweet old cat, soft, lazy, and indifferent to almost everything. He had always been so mellow that squirrels used to throw pecans at him from the trees, and he wouldn't even flinch. But now, his fur bristled, his back arched, and his eyes were wide and wild, locked on the hallway behind him. His growl deepened, then he hissed, long, sharp, and full of warning. I had never seen him like this before. My heart started to hammer in my chest. My cat wasn't looking at me. He was watching something behind me, something I couldn't see. The weight of the house pressed in around me. The darkness beyond that small room suddenly felt occupied. I swallowed hard and stood slowly, my skin crawling. The cat took a defensive stance in front of me, his tail puffed, ears pinned back. He was blocking me from leaving the room. And then I heard something else, a sound, so soft, so subtle, I almost missed it. A faint creak from deeper inside the house. My body locked up, every muscle tense. That creak, it came from the hallway. I wasn't alone. I felt a sudden suffocating sense of dread, like unseen eyes were crawling over me. My cat growled again, louder this time, and I knew, instinctively, undeniably, that something was very, very wrong. I grabbed my cat and bolted. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled out onto the porch, the night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't stop moving. I sprinted down the driveway, gripping my cat so tightly, he let out a startled yelp. That's when I saw it. A cop car patrolling slowly down the street. Desperation took over. I ran straight into the road, frantically waving my arms. The officers inside slammed on the brakes. I barely managed to gasp out what happened, my words tangled with panic. Something was in the house. The officers exchanged a look before ordering me to stay in the car. Then, with hands on their weapons, they advanced toward the house. Seconds felt like hours. I sat in the cruiser, my cat trembling in my lap, his eyes still locked on the house. Then the officers re-emerged, faces grim. They found the back door wide open. I felt my stomach drop. My parents never left doors unlocked, much less open. That door had been closed when I got home. I was sure of it. One officer knelt beside the car and met my eyes. "We've been patrolling the area," he said carefully. "We've been looking for someone. A man." My skin went cold. "There's a serial killer in the area. We believe he's been moving from house to house, looking for an opportunity." He hesitated. "You might have just gotten really lucky tonight." My entire body turned to ice. I stared at the darkened house, the knowledge settling like a weight in my chest. The feeling I had, the unease, the fear, it wasn't paranoia, it was real. And if it weren't for my cat, I might not be alive to tell this story.